Hello, beautiful ladies and beautiful gentlemen. I am Binz, and welcome to the next video in the Shapez BEASTMAM series. After having dealt with the way the input signals are manipulated in order to smoothly get the flat piece factories rolling, we have arrived at what could be considered the big fish of this episode, the CSC. CSC is yet another label I invented, and it designates the combiner, smelter, cutter modules that the flat piece factories have. Today, we are going to have a look at the mechanisms that steer the behavior of the filters. More specifically, we have 3 of those filters. The first one is actually a set of 4, but I count them as 1 for convenience sake because they are all connected to the same wire. So either all 4 of them will be closed or all 4 of them will be open simultaneously. They are marked in red and they determine whether the CSC will be used at all or not. Then we've got the filter I marked in green, responsible for deciding whether the shape will be laser cut or not. And finally, the blue filter toggles whether the shapes will be cut vertically or not. So then, with so many shapes and so many possibilities, how can we set up a wiring module that operates those filters correctly every time? Well, before we can build anything, we need to know which behavior to program. And before we can do that, we need to know what the behavior is. All right, so let me take you back to the smelt type paradigm we already saw in the video about preliminary rotation. There are 12 scenarios in total, and we came up with unique 4-digit codes to describe them. Today, we are going to use those codes again, and we are actually going to do the exact same thing we did before. We are going to try to find patterns or coincidences in them. So let's also pull up this sheet we had created for it previously, as that will be easier to work with. Now, this time around, as we are not trying to come up with a rotation system, but with a cut system, the codes we will compare with one another are going to be grouped differently. Okay, as a reminder, in our module, we have 3 filters. The red one that determines whether the CSC will be used at all or not, which I will label with a question mark, like so. Then we have the green one that determines whether the CSC will be laser cut, and because of the laser cutter, I will mark this with an L. And then finally the blue one that determines, so the blue filter that determines whether the CSC will need to cut in half. And so I will label that with a capital letter H. Okay, now let's look at the shapes again and fill out our table. For the first scenario, well, we don't need to use the CSC. And that is, as a matter of fact, the only case where we don't need to use the CSC. In all other cases, we do. And in the case where we don't need to use the CSC, we are also not going to care about the position of the filters that trigger the laser cutter or the halves cutter because the shapes won't be passing by them anyway. So whichever mechanism or whichever solution we find for this problem, it is not going to matter how it affects these 2 filters, all right? Now for the other cases, obviously they are going to matter. If we are dealing with the second scenario, a shape that is entirely smelted, then we don't want to use the laser cutter nor the halves cutter. If we are dealing with any of these 2 scenarios, then we won't want to use the laser cutter, but we will want to use the halves cutter. The third group, or the fourth group, there we will need to use the laser cutter, but not the halves cutter. And then finally, the group with the shapes that have this blue edge right here, the T shapes as I call them, for those we will need to use both of the cutters. And now we are going to look for patterns again. Now, at this point, I do want to say something. Finding a solution for this problem has not been a matter of divine intervention. It's not like I have been touched by God and have seen the light. No, this is a staring contest. You stare at this list and it stares back at you until one of you dies. Okay, this is trial and error, followed by more trial and even more error. This is starting over and over and over and over until you find something that you think might work, and then you explore that road for a bit, hit a dead end, try branching off, hit another dead end, and it's back to square one. Coming up with this 4-digit list in the first place is already the result of a gajillion other things I tried before that didn't work, okay? And so are the things that we are about to do with this list. And I do want to point this out because I have received very humbling names that I personally feel I am not worthy of. And while I obviously find them very flattering, they are simply not true. All it takes is determination to get this done, and then a lot of time, like a lot of time. All right, so if you are building stuff and you get stuck, please don't let that demotivate you. Try again. Find out why it doesn't work. Set a goal. Figure out what you need to reach that goal. Work your way down from that goal to the point where you are, and then eventually you will get there. All right? So what I eventually found in this list is the following. I noticed that these two cases, these are the categories with the red shapes right here. These two cases are the only cases where we are dealing with an alternation between ones and zero. These two cases are the only cases where we do not have two adjacent zeros nor ones. Take into account that the last digit and the first digit, they also count as adjacent in that sense, all right? And I'm going to mark these things. I'm going to give them a purplish color. Come on now, there we go. Okay, that's one thing. And then the second thing I noticed, and that's also going to be important, is that this last group with these shapes right here, the blue ones, they're the only category where we have 3 ones in all of the codes. All of the other codes strictly contain a maximum of 2 ones, not counting this top one, which we will get back to later. These ones, I'm going to give them this this golden color. All right, and now the question is, on the wiring layer, how can we set up a module that filters or that at least detects these two scenarios? Let's have a look at that next. So we're gonna go to the wiring layer where I set up this module we looked at last time. If you don't remember, here's what that module does. It is going to compare two quadrants, two adjacent quadrants of a shape, more specifically the rightmost two, the bottommost two, the leftmost two, and the topmost two. And it is going to check whether those are smelted or not. That's where this list of ones and zeros, this 4-digit code, where it comes from. Right, and we have our we have our categories, so we can test that for a bit. And now, the way we could check for this is with XOR gates. This screams XOR gates to me. Whenever you have an alternation of ones and zeros, that's where the XOR gates could come in handy. So here's what we get. I placed this right here. This is a kind of thing that we are going to use. And I'm going to build that on top of this, like so. Let's zoom out and connect a display real quick. So you're going to see that with the XOR gates, what this is going to do is that they're only going to trigger a 1 if a maximum of one signal input gets a 1. And this is only going to be the case in these two scenarios right here. In all of the other cases, we are going to get at least one case where we have two adjacent ones, and all I want all 3 of these XOR gates to be a 1. Only then we want to have a 1 on this output right here. So let's compare that to our categories. If we get a fully smelted shape, we don't get an output. If we get this 4th category, we don't get an output. If we get the last category, we don't get an output. And only if we have this one right here with the 2 halves, then we will get a 1 on this line. So that's how we could check for that right here. Now, let's try the other one. How can we determine whether there are at least 3 1s in this code? Well, I decided to convert any positive signal, so any truthy value, to a circle shape, stack that, and then count how many layers the stacked shape has. So let's do that. We're gonna put that in, and we're gonna connect it like so. And you know what? I am also going to write this down. So let's create a yellow column right here and a purple column right there, like so. And we're gonna write this down, okay? Let me connect a display to this as well. There we go. Okay, and now we're gonna go over the categories. If we have a fully smelted shape, then we have a 0 on the purple wire, like so, and a 0, we're gonna count this null value, we're gonna write that down as a 0 as well, on this wire as well. If we try the 2nd category, then we will get 2 layers right here, and we will get a 1 on this line. Okay, let's try the next category. Here we will get a shape with 2 layers and a 0 on this line. All right, and then finally, the last category. Here we get 3 layers and a 0 on this wire. Okay, so now let's look at the trigger for the laser cutter first, because I believe that one is a bit easier. I'm going to get, sorry about that. I'm going to get rid of these 2 displays again. And now we're going to have a closer look at the list and at the wires. So we want the laser cutter to be bypassed in these 3 cases. These are the only cases where we aren't going to use the laser cutter, explicitly not going to use it. And all the other cases, we are going to use it. So what we could do is the following. These are the only cases where this line is going to output a 1, right? And we want the laser cutter to be used in all of these cases. So when this is a 0, then we definitely want to use it. But we don't want to use it if this digit is also a 0. So what we could do, in other words, is we could set up an XOR gate between these 2 things. Oh, a bit sloppy here. Like so. And that is what we are going to connect to the laser cutter output. Let's see if that works. We're going to try our categories again. In a fully smelted shape, we don't want to use the laser cutter. So what do we get on the XOR gate? We get a 0 on this line, on the yellow line. We get a 0 on the purple line, and therefore we also get a 0 on the laser cutter output line. That's good. So far, so good. In the second case, with the 2 halves, we're going to get something different. Now, we are going to get a signal on this wire, but we're also going to get a 1 on this wire. And because we put an XOR gate in between, that is going to translate to a 0. So in this case, we also will not use the laser cutter. And now let's look at the other 2 signals. In this category, we will get a signal from the top, but we won't get one from the bottom. So the XOR gate triggers a 1, and in that case, we will use the laser cutter. And then finally, the last group is going to be the same thing. Here, we get a signal. Here we don't. And again, we are going to get a 1. And that is how we use the laser cutter. Next, let's look at the normal cutter. And this is going to be a bit more complicated because here we have to pay attention to the digits that are given in this column right here. We want to single out, if we want to single out this case, then we need to count how many quadrants we find on the code shape, how many layers we find on the code shape that we've created. So we can use an unstacker for that. Where's my unstacker? Here it is. There we go. That is what we will have a look at. And if we get a signal on this wire right here, that is going to be one case where we want to use the halves cutter. But not only that, this accounts for these cases. This setup right here, it accounts for these cases, but we also want to use the halves cutter in these two cases. These are the only two cases where we have a 1 in this column right here, or in other words, on this wire. So we are going to connect that with an OR gate. If either of these two criteria is true, then we want to use the halves cutter, and otherwise we don't. So let's try that again with these categories. If we have a fully smelted shape, we don't want to use either of the cutters. If we have a shape smelted half and half, we want to use the halves cutter, but not the laser cutter. If we have a 3/4 smelted with a cutout, we want to use the laser cutter, but not the halves cutter. And in the last case, with the T kind of shape, we want to use both. That is how that could work. And then there is another observation, actually. In the actual CSC, let's focus on these two filters first. We wrote down a 1, so in our list, we wrote down a 1 if we want to use these modules and a 0 if we don't want to use these modules. But if we look closely, then because of the way the filters are oriented, we actually want a 0 signal in cases where we want to use the laser cutter or the halves cutter. So the thing I'm going to do is finally, lastly, place NOT gates on here, because we want an answer. We don't want an answer to the fact, do we want to use this? We want to know which signal the filters need to get, right? So we require a NOT gate right here. And then there is one final thing we need to take into consideration for the CSC, and that is whether we are going to use it at all or not. And again, we are going to look at our list on the right. And a criterion that I found that works is the consideration that the case where we don't need to smelt anything, that is the only case where we have 4 1s in our code. So the way we could translate that, for example, let's get back to where we were, to the example setup right here. The way we could do that is simply by branching off of here, for example. That is something we could do. If we get an output right here, then it means we need to use the CSC. No, we don't need to use the CSC. That's the way it is. And otherwise, we do. Right? So the way that works in practice, again, is the same module, basically. But again, it's compressed and it looks a lot more, confusing, a lot less transparent. But what we get is that the actual shape that we want, the actual shape input signal, it comes down here. We get this module that determines whether the halves are smelted, yes or no. We convert the amount of positive signals into a shape with a certain layer count. And then, just the way we saw it before, but a bit more compressed and a bit more tucked away, we are going to operate these filters. that is how that works. And let me tell you that this was a very hard nut to crack for me. As I said before, it took me a lot of searching. This was not a moment where I suddenly saw the light, the divine light. No, this was a struggle. This was an obstacle course that I had to start over millions of times, right? It really took a long time to figure this out. And yeah, while we are at it, I actually want to talk about something I maybe should have talked about before, but I forgot. So yeah, let's annex that in, and that's this little module right here that's doing the rotations at the end. So in this case, it looks like we don't have any rotations going on. Let's see if I have another example. Nope. No. And also no. Are you kidding me? Well then, okay. Let's try. How about this then? Then we just force it out of the machine, right? Now we should be getting a rotation. Is that correct? Yeah, now we are getting some rotations. Okay, great. So when we talked about the preliminary rotation, we looked at these things right here, and then we looked at the signal that travels up here, how the signal gets rotated and then sent back, but we didn't follow it the other way around. We are going to use the same signal to create the counter rotation, because those two are always going to go hand in hand, obviously. If our preliminary rotation is 90 degrees clockwise, for example, then the posterior rotation is going to be 90 degrees counterclockwise. If it's 180 when it goes in, we have to rotate it 180 when it goes out, right? So those things are always linked, and the sum of those rotations is always going to be 360 degrees, right? That's a given. So the way I set this up is actually pretty simple. I have red for a 0 degree rotation, yellow for a 90 degrees clockwise rotation, green for 180, and blue for 270. So what I did was I connected one clockwise rotation and one 180 rotation. And then if we need a 90 degree rotation, well, then we are going to use this one. If we needed 180, then we're going to use this one. And if we have both, then if we have 270, sorry, then we are going to need to use both. So I simply set it up so that if we have a red signal, then both of these filters will be open. If we have a yellow signal where we need to rotate 90 degrees, then we will only close this filter but leave the other one open. This is the current case right here. If we have a green signal, which means 180 rotation, then we will get a signal match right here. That will trigger this, that will trigger this, and this will close this set of filters, but not the other one. And then finally, if we have blue, then both of these will be triggered and both of these filters will be closed. All right. So a lot of stuff is going on below the surface. I hope that this video has been able to convince you about that. And yeah, as I said before, it was this was one of the biggest obstacles in this machine. Apart from the decoder, this was a hard thing to do, and I am secretly very proud that I managed to pull it off. I'm not going to lie. So I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope you are, as always, I hope you are excited to see what's coming up next. If you are, be sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you get those updates. And if you like this video, then please give it a thumbs up. It's always greatly appreciated. Leave a nice comment, all that good stuff. And then all that's left for me to do today is sign off, wishing you an excellent day and thanking you for having joined. Take care, everyone. See you next time. I am off. Bye.